over the second half of Morgenthau's Politics Among Nations. We're at Part 6, Limitation of International Power and International Law. We started the last section that we showed that, balance of power, but Morgenthau just calls it power, doesn't quite preserve the international peace. So we got a bunch of different options that could potentially preserve international peace. He's going to conclude that these options all do not work, and that the best option we have is diplomacy, which how he concludes his work. So we're going to go by one. Start with international law. He starts, the same caution against extremes with which we have started the discussion of international morality and of world public opinion must also apply to the discussion of international law. An increasing number of writers express the opinion that there is no such thing as international law. A diminishing number of observers hold that international law, if duly codified and extended to regulate the political relations of states, could become, through its own inner force, if not a substitute for, at least a restraining influence upon the struggle for power on the international scene. So a large amount of people, professors who have talked to Morgenthau, or just realism, under the impression that Morgenthau believes that international law just is a farce that doesn't work, we should ignore it. It's clearly not of that opinion, and we're going to see his thoughts on it. It includes that it's not going to preserve the peace, but that is not a non-factor per se. There we go. If there was to be at least a certain measure of peace and order, there must be certain rules of conduct defined beforehand, whose violation would normally call forth sanctions, and also beforehand as to their nature, the conditions, and mode of their application. So this is more of a call to needing normative standards on the international stage to make sure that when states do interact, they know what's to expect, what's going on. And one of the main parts of norms, or international law in this case, is that you know how to react negatively to a country given their certain action. So like we know what imperialism looks like, we see it's negative because of normative standards, or normative standards change across time. As we discussed in the 16th century and the 19th century, there's international morality. States have stronger reactions to things they wouldn't have a reaction to in the past, so on and so forth. These rules of international law were securely established in 1648 when the Treaty of Westphalia brought the religious wars to an end and made the territorial state the cornerstone of the modern state system. A brief history. Before 1648, there wasn't really states as they thought of because they lacked sovereignty back then. States really started to form in reaction to the papal absolutist movements, the council movements. So basically, around the 13th century, 12th century, 11th century, the church was becoming very corrupt. So the church went about the Cluny reforms. Cluny is a abbey that some rich noblemen bought and gave back to the church to reform themselves. And through the reforms, they basically made a new form of law that was self-coherent and contained. The Roman law was very messy, but they made their own system of law that it was first self-contained system of law, and it works fantastically to give the Vatican centralized power over all the churches spread out everywhere. The states look at this and say, oh, we need to copy this reform and make our own centralized law. So the kings, at the time we had feudalism, so you had the barons, people below the baron, people above the baron. The king was highest above the baron. The king said, well, if you people rise against the barons, I'll give you rights in return for making me your sovereign. A sovereign is someone that dictates the rules of the land. So the kings kind of led like a rights movement backed by popular support to then centralize command over the state. And really before, they couldn't really do this anyways before the church started expanding out into all the rural areas. By establishing the church in all the rural areas, they had centralized force. The state then used that centralized structure built up by the church to help centralize the state. So it wasn't really until around 1640 that we could have the modern idea of statehood. So, yeah, as I said, the Treaty of Westphalia established that. We're going to get into sovereignty later on. There's also It's also worth mentioning, in view of a widespread misconception in this respect, that during the 400 years of its existence, international law has in most instances been scrupulously observed. When one of its rules was violated, it was, however, not always enforced, and when enforcement action was actually taken, it was not always effective. Yet to deny that international law exists at all as a system of binding legal rules flies in the face of all evidence. This misconception as to the existence of international law is at least in part the result of the disproportionate attention which public opinion has paid in recent times, 1950s, to a small fraction of international law, while neglecting the main body of it. Public opinion has been concerned mainly with the spectacular instruments of international law, such as the Bryan-Kellogg Pact, the Covenant of the League of Nations, and the Charter of the United Nations. These instruments are indeed of doubtful efficacy, and sometimes even of doubtful validity. They are, however, not typical of the traditional rules of international law, concerning, for instance, the limits of territorial jurisdiction, the rights of vessels in foreign waters, and the status of diplomatic representatives. To recognize international law exists, however, is not tantamount to asserting that it is effective in regulating and restraining the struggle for power. He gives reason for this. The first is the problem of decentralization. The main bulk of rules of international law owe their existence to the mutual consent of the individual subjects of international law themselves. Many matters bearing upon international relations, such as immigration and many aspects of economic policies, are not regulated by international law. The interests of the different nations in these matters are so divergent that they are unable to agree upon legal rule. As Morgenthau repeatedly hits throughout the second half of the book, the main problem against going about international peace is the sovereignty of states, and that he's going to conclude that if states were willing to give up parts of their sovereignty, we could have world peace. We'll get to that. And the next problem is codification. It goes along with the previous statement. In order to remedy this situation and strengthen international law as a system of rules capable of regulating and restraining the international conduct of states, numerous attempts have been made since the end of the 19th century to codify international law. And it gives a brief history of this. It was the Conference on the Progressive Codification of International Law, held under the auspices of the League of Nations at The Hague in The Hague in 1930, which removed all doubts as to the great difficulties in codifying any branch of law, however technical, once the nations concerned have identified themselves as a particular point of view. It revealed also outright impossibility of codification where the national interests of nations, however insignificant, are involved. Quote two professors saying, foreign offices added so many qualifications to what have been considered perfectly straightforward rules of international customary law that the attempt to codify merely compromised formally unchallenged principles of international customary law. So, that's to say, Morgenthau makes the case that international law is sort of like heuristics on the world stage in the same way that norms are between people. So you start trying to hammer these out and get specifics. You make negotiations, well, you force negotiations to occur, or rather they just go about things naturally through social order. We're going to get this, at the end of the section we get to diplomacy. He's going to talk about how we try to parliamentarize when diplomatic relations go on. And this formality has really ruined how effective diplomacy can be. And we're adding this layer of institutional formality to how nations interact, and it's messing things up. You're raising up problems that would never really be raised in the first place, or if they were raised, to be taken care of informally through the normal diplomatic avenues. So now, by bringing up these points around what's normally agreed upon rules, you call into question the rule themselves and makes us contemplate it and possibly forego it. So then the problem of interpretation and binding force. First, legal documents such as those created by the League of Nations are vague and ambiguous, not by accident, but regularly and of necessity. If this should happen in the domestic sphere like the U.S. Constitution, the Supreme Court would give concrete meaning to the vague, ambiguous provisions of the law. And the international field is subjects of the law themselves, which not only legislate for themselves, but are also the supreme authority in interpreting and giving concrete meaning to their own legislative enactments, and will naturally interpret in light of their national interests. So, as mentioned, that the international laws are intentionally vague because it allows for smoother interactions between states and such. And you get the problem of sovereignty again, that you can't really appeal to a higher court because nations are sovereign, and he gets into the whole court system, I think, right now. So, Fourth Amendment, there's a problem because international law is deficient in all three fundamentals of an official judicial system, compulsory jurisdiction, hierarchy of judicial decisions, and the application of the rule of state diocese, at least to the decisions of the highest court. Morgenthau really goes into depth with the history of all the court system in international law. I'm not going that amount of depth. I might do in the future a specific series on international law and international courts, but it's a bit beyond the purview of what's necessary to cover Morgenthau in a timely manner. So if you're interested in the history of all these international organizations, all this international law, feel free to read the second half of the book. I'm going to cover what I think is the key takeaways from the section. Compulsory jurisdiction. The sole source of the jurisdiction of international courts is the will of the states submitting disputes for adjudication. No international court can take jurisdiction over international disputes without the consent of the states concerned. As per the executive, international law does not even provide for agencies or instrumentalities for the purposes of enforcement apart from the agencies and instrumentalities of the national governments. Perhaps the main problem is that nobody at all has the obligation to enforce international law. We have to go back to the problem of sovereignty, that, we're doing this amongst each other. There's no sovereign to make sure that law is enforced. And, must be pointed out, however, that the actual suggestion is much less dismal, or the actual situation is much less dismal than foregoing analysis might suggest. A great majority of the rules of international law are generally observed by all states without actual compulsion, for it is generally in the interest of all states concerned to honor the obligations under international law. Thus, the great majority of rules of international law are generally unaffected by the weakness of its system of enforcement. I really say that most of the laws are pragmatic for each other, such as freedom of navigation and respect between borders. These help states mutually, so they're inclined to follow it. Prisoner's dilemma, stuff like that. Treaties can be guaranteed by an outside party. The simplest treaty of guarantee, and guarantees where you have a third party make sure that two parties follow it, or it can be more than two parties, but there's at least an outside enforcer, is exemplified by what is generally considered the earliest such treaty in modern history. The Treaty of Blois of 1505 between France and Aragon, guaranteed by England. This guarantee signified that England took upon itself the legal obligation to perform the task of policeman with regard to the execution of this treaty. Kind of similar to how England also played the role of I think it's called the balancer, or the holder of the balance, as mentioned in the balance of power section on last episode. In order to be able to function as a substitute for centralized executive agencies, treaty must be effective, and their execution must be automatic. By having a treaty guarantee, the execution is in theory automatic, especially if the guarantor has in their interest the survival of the treaty. So to take balance of power, the balancer has in their interest preserving the balance of power, so to be automatic. So we're hoping the treaties made with a treaty of guarantee will be automatic in the same regard that is in the interest of the balancer. Collective security is by far the most far-reaching attempt on record to overcome the deficiencies of a completely centralized system of law enforcement. So Morgenthau then spends the last chapter studying the collective security of the League and why it kind of failed. Essentially, it comes down. I think he gets into this later. He does not come back to it, but I'm pretty sure I have some quotes about this coming later. Moving on to sovereignty. The modern conception of sovereignty was first formulated in the latter part of the 16th century with reference to the new phenomenon of the territorial state. It referred to in legal terms the elemental political fact of the age, the appearance of a centralized power which exercises lawmaking and law enforcing authority within a certain territory. The end of the 30 Years' War, sovereignty was supreme power over a certain territory was a political fact, signifying the victory of the territorial princes over the universal authority of the emperor and the pope, on the one hand, and over the particularistic aspirations of feudal barons on the other. The monarch was now supreme within his territory, not only as a matter of political fact, but also as a matter of law. The doctrine of sovereignty has retained its importance throughout the modern period of history, and the conception of popular sovereignty has been provided by the national democratic state with a potent political weapon. Yet, it has also been subject to reinterpretation, revisions, and attacks, especially in the field of international law. The source of these doubts and difficulties lies in the fact that the assumption of international law imposing legal restraints upon individual states seem to be logically incompatible with the assumption of these states being sovereign, that is, being the supreme law and creating and law enforcing authorities, but not themselves subject to legal restraints. In truth, however, sovereignty is incompatible only with a strong and effective, but because centralized, system of national law. It is not at all inconsistent with a decentralized, hence weak and ineffective international legal order. For national sovereignty is the very source of that decentralization, weakness, and ineffectiveness. Sovereignty is not freedom from legal restraint. It is not freedom from regulation by international law of all those matters traditionally left to the discretion of the individual state. It is not equality of rights and obligations under international law. It is not actual independence in political, military, economic, and technological matters. By independence, it means like if I do X, Y, Z actions on a national stage, it won't affect anybody else. But because if I start building my military, start an arms race, perhaps accidentally, I'm not independent per se, but I am sovereign to take that decision if I so choose to. Essentially, sovereignty is the idea that I'm an actor under the natural constraints of the world, rather than I'm independent from the consequences of my actions. Under what conditions, then, does a state lose its sovereignty? A state may take upon itself legal obligations which give another state final authority over its law-giving and law-enforcing activities. The other way sovereignty can be lost is the loss of what we call impenetrability of a state's territory, or being conquered. But the first one, Morgenthau asks this question because he thinks that a state needs to lose its sovereignty over its military forces in order to secure world peace. So he doesn't really actually tie it back in effectively at the end, but this section carries a lot more weight than a first reading of it would. Moving on. The world politics of the 20th century. The limitations upon the struggle of power on the international scene are weaker today than they have been at any time in history in the modern state system. The one international society in the 17th and 18th century has been replaced by a number of national societies. Far from international law restraining the aspiration for power of individual nations, they see to it that power position of individual nations not adversely affected by whatever legal obligations they take upon themselves in relation to other nations. And supranational forces such as universal religions, humanitarianism, cosmopolitanism, and all other personal ties, institutions, and organizations which bind individuals together across national boundaries are infinitely weaker today than the forces which unite people within particular national boundaries to separate them from the rest of humanity. And this, of course, changes very quickly in reality because the EU is formed within 30, 40, 50 years. But in 1950, the view was quite dismal, especially in Europe. The nationalism of the mid-20th century is essentially different from what traditionally goes by the name and what accumulated in the national movements of the national state of the 19th century. Traditional nationalism sought to free the nation from alien domination and give it a state of its own. The national of the day, which is really a nationalistic universalism, has only one thing in common with the nationalism of the 19th century, that is, the nation as the ultimate point of reference for political loyalties and actions. Here, however, the similarity ends. The nationalistic universalism of our age claims for one nation and one state the right to impose its own evaluations and standard of action on the other nations. And Morgenthau, I guess the major thrust of this book is trying to get people to realize that we've gone under a significant change in morality, and hence what we thought would be work for the national peace in the 19th century is definitely not going to work in the 20th century. And we still see the problems of nationalistic universalism today, like the U.S., especially in the neoconservative movement and the progressive movement of Morgenthau's time, was going about the world today trying to force its values on everybody else, which, setting aside whether that is a morally good action to help others adopt the U.S. morality, that is not what Morgenthau sees as pragmatic and ends up hurting more people than helping because it's not pragmatic. And nowadays we see, well, under writing an article on this now, if you want to go to my Substack, probably post it in a few hours when I finish it, that under the Hu Jintao era, well, in China, so you had Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and then now Xi Jinping. Under Jiang Zemin, the tensions with Taiwan really got ramped up, but under Hu Jintao, he decided to open up more societal ties with the U.S. and Taiwan. So U.S. Taiwan, U.S. China, China Taiwan relations all dramatically improved under the Hu Jintao reign. Hu Jintao, even by U.S. China scholars, talk about this weak leader that just led China astray for about 10 years, which is the China scholars in even the U.S. or everywhere really have a strong propensity to listen to what the Chinese propagandists say to take it as truth. It's a mind-boggling phenomenon that happens across all the understanding of Chinese history. I really don't understand it. But in any case, so they see Hu Jintao is weak, and that's what Xi Jinping says. Hu Jintao actually greatly increased the chances of peace between all three nations. And then Xi Jinping now is adopting this nationalist universalism. We saw that he was offended by Hong Kong's existence, even though the Chinese economy through Shenzhen, which is Shenzhen, China Silicon Valley, was only a thing because it lives 1 mile away from Hong Kong. I lived in both cities for quite some time. You can see both cities from the other one. And people just cross the border on the daily. They live in Shenzhen because it's cheaper to live than go work in Hong Kong to make more money. It's an interesting system. But anyways, by killing the Hong Kong economy, by taking it over in 2019, because frankly this was offended by its existence, they've ruined their economy in many significant ways. Because Hong Kong was also where they cleared the international version of the currency. That aside, it's just an embodiment of nationalistic universalism. They took over Hong Kong because he wants to pose his values upon it. Same thing with Taiwan. He wants to pose his values on Taiwan. That's not very pragmatic for him because it's going to hurt everyone to go about that. But it's just an embodiment of national universalism that was not present in Hu Jintao when Hu Jintao lacked it. And Obama had less of it than Bush did. Peace relations are ongoing, but now that both the U.S. and China have national universalism, our chances for peace are quite low. Is what Morgenthau's arguing here. They're trying to argue that the U.S. should not be have nationalistic universalism. And he wrote this during the Truman years, which was the absolute peak of it. And I'd probably go to history, probably the next episode when I get into Kennan. That's probably when I get into that history. And then he makes some great predictions. Like he talks about the shift from the multipolar world to a bipolar one between two superpowers. He kind of got that one dead right. We'll talk about bipolarity in a different episode. But essentially, like we have the structural relation between a multipolar world and multiple great powers and just one giant US, one USSR is structurally different, so we should expect different things, and he goes into all that. But different episode. So in the period between 1870 and 1914, the stability of the status quo in Europe was the direct result, on one hand, of the risk implicit in even the smallest move at the frontiers of the great powers themselves, and on the other, the opportunity of changing the status quo in outlying regions without incurring the danger of general conflagration. When Bismarck declared in 1876 that as far as the interest of the Germany was concerned, I'll just talk about this one up here. So, what Morgenthau is doing here is that, I forgot to say it, colonial frontier. So within Europe at this time period, 1800s, you still had the colonial empire wanting to build up to try to satisfy the desire for increasing one's power, which all the states at the time had. But if you did that within Europe, like you tried to change the boundaries of the states within Europe at the time, it could be catastrophic. So Morgenthau's arguing here that in this new world, where it's bipolar, there's no more colonial frontier because everywhere is considered important when you have national universalism. Like Kennan's going to argue that we really shouldn't care about Korea. But with a nationalistic universal view, we need to care about Korea. And the Soviet Union definitely had a nationalistic universalist view. They want worldwide communism. That's the whole worldwide Bolshevism. That's the general idea. So he's going to argue that because we lost this boundary, we naturally have more tensions as we can. And we'll get into that more when we get to the final chapter of diplomacy, some more of the problems between the USSR and the U.S. So when Bismarck declared in 1876 that as far as the interests of Germany were concerned, the Balkans were not worth the good bones of a single Pomeranian musketeer, he affirmed emphatically that the peripheral character of the Balkan question view of the political and military interests of Germany. When the German government in July 1914 promised to support whatever steps Austria decided to take against Serbia, it did the exact opposite, and for no good reason. Germany identified itself with the Austrian interest, while Russia identified itself with Serbia's. Thus, a conflict at the periphery of the European state system transformed itself to a struggle which threatened to affect the overall distribution of power within that system. Bargaining had become, if not, as not to be the bargaining away of one's vital interests. or bargaining would become impossible if it was not to be the bargain away one's vital interest, because you consider that the peripheral interest is not your vital interest. Concessions at somebody else's expense could no longer be made because identification of one's interest with the interest of the smaller nations involved to turn concessions at the apparent expense, but others a concession at one's own expense. So the Korean War, the actual main combat of it kind of stopped after I think it was a year or two, but the war dragged on for another like 5 years because they decided to make the concession actually end the war. And at the end of the day, we've got the same starting point where we started at. But the more you care about your personal interests, the less you can compromise. We came about in July 1914 as the day became an ineluctable result of structural change in the balance of power. As the balance of power becomes worldwide with its main weights on 3 different continents, the dichotomy between the circle of great powers and its periphery must of necessity disappear. When formerly empty spaces lie east and west, north and south, where 2 superpowers must approach each other for friendly or hostile contacts. Into those spaces, the 2 remaining great contenders on the international scene have poured their own power, creating 2 great blocks. Now, the balance of power, once disturbed, can be restored only, if at all, by an increase in the weaker side's military strength, rather than just getting more colonial frontier. The Morgenthau sees this as one of the main points of tension that's me playing out between the USSR and the US. Chapter 20, Total War. So the idea of total war in history, I don't think it gives a history of it, is that von Clausewitz, a Prussian officer, after the Napoleonic Wars, basically come up with the idea that we're now in a period where nations use their total society, total war to go about waging war against each other, and that war switched from being about getting minor concessions to being about getting a total victory where one annihilates the other person's army, because now we're fighting with total societies. So we're going to argue that the conditions we are in right now favor total war rather than more limited wars to get strategic aims. At the beginning of the 18th century, war was limited and has been so since the beginning of the modern state system. Let us take the Italian wars of the 14th and 15th centuries. These wars were fought primarily by mercenaries who, their interest being in the main financial, were not eager to die in battle or to invite that risk by killing too many of their enemies. Furthermore, the condottieri, the leaders of the contending armies, were not interested in sacrificing their soldiers, for the soldiers constituted their working capital. Or did the condottieri want to kill many enemy soldiers, for as prisoners they'd be sold for ransom or hired as soldiers for their own armies, but they could not be put to financial gain after they'd been slain. The moral factor of total war is revival in the 20th century of the doctrine of just war. That is to say, the distinction between belligerents whose participation in war is justified in ethics and law, and those who are not considered to have the legal and moral right to take up arms. This doctrine dominated the Middle Ages, but with the ascendancy of the modern state system was watered down to the point of vanishing. Throughout the period of limited warfare, the distinction between just and unjust war remained at best ambiguous, and was finally abandoned in the 19th century when war was considered a mere fact, the conduct of which was subject to certain moral and legal rules, but of which all states had a legal and moral right to avail themselves at their discretion. It ties in with the idea of sovereignty, and in the 19th century the international system was seen as more amoral than a system or a place for good and evil battle itself. And once you think of good and evil battle itself again on the national stage, then the just war doctrine comes back. Nationalism in the Napoleonic Wars, and in Germany and the Italian Wars of national unification in the 19th century, and the nationalistic universalism in the 2 world wars of the 20th century, have supplied the principle of justice, and with it, that passion and enthusiasm which restored the masses of fighting men, the willingness to conquer and die for an idea. During the periods of limited warfare, desertions not only of individual whole units were common. During the religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries, whole armies changed sides time and time again. When the Protestants and Catholics fought each other over the issue of whose religion would prevail, to be roughly the 30 Years' War, that ended the Treaty of Westphalia, the unifying cause and the mass capable of being unified under that cause has materialized. The French law of 1793, making military service compulsory for all able-bodied men between the ages of 18 and 25, was the first legislative recognition of the new character of war. So this law of 1793 is actually quite significant. That well, widely popularly supported. So when it got announced in the town square, a man on a box reading it, the crowd cheered so much over and over again. They kept asking the person, "Oh, read it again, read it again." They kept reading it like 5 times over because they're so enthused about this universal compulsory conscription because they believed so much in the ideals of republicanism and then Bonapartism after that. So, and nowadays, like you think of the U.S., like conscription has like a negative connotation. Back then, they were enthralled by the concept of um, compulsory military service, even those that were being drafted. If anything, the people that got drafted in the most were the ones that liked it the most at the time. So, peace through limitation. Uh, Chapter 21, Disarmament. True world wars within a generation, the potentialities of mechanized warfare have made the establishment of international order and the preservation of international peace the paramount concern of Western civilization. War has always been abhorred as a scourge. Since the time of the Stoics and the early Christians, there's been alive in Western civilization a feeling for the moral unity of mankind which strives to find a political organization commensurate with it. The moral root of these attempts to establish such a stable and peaceful international order is found in the increase in the humaneness and the civilized character of human relations which the last centuries have witnessed in the Western world. Toward the end of the 18th century, it became the conviction that many that war was obsolete or in any case an avatism, which a concerted and rational effort of humanity could abolish from the earth with relative ease. Disarmament, and one of the ways to do propose disarmament, or the international law or international societies we get to, which does argue that all these don't quite work out in reality. Disarmament is the reduction or elimination of certain or all armaments for the purpose of eliminating the arms race. By doing away with one of the typical manifestations of the struggle for power in the national scene, it is believed that one can do away with the typical effects of that struggle. International anarchy and war, the history of the attempts at disarmament, is a story of many failures and few successes. At the foundation of modern philosophy of disarmament, there has been an assumption that men fight because they have arms. Men do not fight because they have arms. They have arms because they deem it necessary to fight. What makes for war are the conditions in the minds of men which make war appear the lesser of two evils. To reduce the quantity of weapons actually or potentiality available at any particular time can have no influence upon the incidence of war. Nations will concentrate all their energies upon the improvement of the quality of such arms and men as they possess. This is exactly what Germany did during the interwar period. They're limited to X number of weapons, so they made those weapons really good, and then eventually just broke the treaty that reduced the arms they could have. Most finally assume that standing armies and their weapons were completely outlawed. The armistice race among hostile nations would simply be postponed to the beginning of the hostilities instead of proceeding and culminating in it, which happened with World War II to a lesser extent. This armament, or at least a regulation of armaments, is an indispensable step in the general settlement of international conflicts. It can, however, not be the first step. A mutually satisfactory settlement of the power contest is a precondition for disarmament. Disarmament, in turn, will contribute greatly to the general pacification. So, there are some nations in Latin America that don't even have a standing army because they're so peaceful with each other, all because the U.S. is above them, like war in Latin America, but that they have been able to fully disarm and not have a military. But it can't be the first step, as Morgenthau says. If you don't trust your neighbor, you still need your weapons. In Europe, trusted Russia enough not to have weapons, but that was a mistake, and the U.S. was yelling at them for a decade, and the Eastern Europe was yelling at Western Europe for a decade to arm, but they never did. And here we are. Chapter 22, Security. The logic of collective security is flawless, provided it can be made to work under conditions prevailing on the national scene. The odds, however, are strongly against such a possibility. It is indeed true that under present conditions of warfare, no less under those of the past, no single country has been strong enough to find a combination of all nations with any success. So, before I continue, the traditional meaning of collective security is different than what we think of nowadays. You think of collective security as like NATO, where all our nations work together to stop a force if we're attacked. That's not the original meaning of collective security. The original meaning was that all nations together agree that we're going to make sure that a nation attacks us within our own system or attack that nation. So think of collective security of Europe. That's to say, if Germany attacked France, all the nations in Europe would attack Germany with France, because Germany attacked France. So then the goal of collective security, Morgenthau's goal, so all the world nations agree that if we're gonna one nation attacks each other, we're all gonna go attack that one nation, then the logic is flawless. But we can't really get all nations to agree upon this. And now the modern meaning is, well, if a nation attacks anybody in the collective security, then we'll attack that nation from the outside system altogether, which, doesn't cause peace. It's going to make sure the war favors those with the alliances, but the modern meaning of collective security is just an alliance structure, not actually a preservation of peace. Unless you're thinking about deterrence, but we haven't been able to deter Russia, and we're probably not going to deter China at the current rate. So collective security is not going to be a cause towards peace, but I'll keep reading. It is indeed true that under present conditions of warfare, no less than under those of the past, no single country is strong enough to defy a combination of all the other nations any chance of success. It's not true nowadays. The U.S. could for about the last century now. Yet it is extremely unlikely that in the actual situation only one single country will be found in the position of the aggressor. Generally, more than one country will actively oppose the order which collective security tries to defend, and other countries will be in sympathy with that opposition. So take Russia invading Ukraine. No one's militarily supporting Russia besides North Korea, but they're probably getting paid. But many countries are in sympathy with Russia, trying to make a multipolar world, as they so claim. I'll discuss that another time. Actually, Canada will discuss that greatly for us, because the U.S., in theory, shouldn't be opposed to a multipolar world. This is that no one else is stepping up to make it multipolar. They'll get into that next episode with Kenneth. In the short run, collective security may succeed in safeguarding a particular status quo because of the temporary weakness of the opponents. Its failure to succeed in the long run, under the assumption of continued conflicting interest, is due to the unwillingness to subordinate conflicting political interests, as doing so would require plain citizens to be ready to lay down their lives for security of any country anywhere on the globe. So discuss this for a little bit. So essentially, let's say we have collective security. The current status quo is now solidified. But let's say that over time, because of internal reforms, some countries naturally should have more status than others. They will be inclined to be imperial and resist the status quo. If there's many such nations, then collective security is going to break down in the long term because they all want to have an improved standing in it. Like look at the Security Council nowadays, France is in there and Britain's in there, but should France and Britain be on the Security Council? Why not Germany instead? So it's kind of unclear why the simplification is a good thing. And then plain citizens. So like, in the 90s when the Rwandan genocide happened, it got lots and lots of news coverage. But if you actually look at genocides across the 20th century, people think the 90s was like this peak in genocides. It actually wasn't. Like it was in the 80s where genocides peaked, and the genocides throughout the 20th century, is that we didn't care about them until after the Soviet threat was over. And even then that we know about them or looking at them more closely, it's like who's going to go lay their lives down for tribal conflicts in Africa or likewise. It doesn't happen. Yeah. Moving on. Tensions are universal phenomena of social life and the domestic fear. 2. A given status quo is stabilized and perpetuated in the legal system. Tension between the status quo and the demand for change frequently resolves itself in domestic affairs into a conflict between courts and defenders of the status quo, and the legislator the champion of change. A similar conflict arose between the United States in the first decade of the 20th century when the status quo of laissez-faire was protected by the courts against social and regulatory legislations. In both cases, change went out, and the courts became the defender of the new status quo. So essentially, the status quo is obviously preserved by the current institutions, and you have to resist the current institutions to make change. But if the current institutions set up don't allow for change, such as collective security, is not going to go about it. Right now, we're talking about how the court. I didn't really have a section for now in the court system. Yeah, the court system. So the courts are going to be ineffective because they can't necessitate change. Like in the U.S., the courts aren't allowed to make political decisions. Changing the status quo is a political decision, has to be done by the legislator. But in the case of international law, if we don't have mechanisms for the allowing to change the status quo in a solidified system, we're going to bring about war. And the U.S., our system works because we have natural ways to allow status quo to change, but the courts defend something else, which is what I just brought up here. You're going to see that it doesn't happen in the natural stage. 3 factors made this peaceful transformation possible. 1, the ability of public opinion to express itself freely. 2, the ability of social political institutions to absorb the pressure of public opinion. and 3. The ability of the state to protect the new status quo against violent change. However, courts or international bodies cannot help change the status quo in absence of international morality. If the parties concerned agree, a recommendation on part of an international body is superfluous. If the parties concerned do not agree, peaceful change is possible only under the ideal conditions of collective security, where overwhelming force is marshaled against the dissenting party. Either recommendations of change will not be enforced, or a war between the nations favoring and those opposing change will decide the issue. At the end of the day, Morgenthau brought up in the first part, everything's about power. If the nation disagrees with the status quo, it will be power that stops it from actually changing the status quo. There's a lot moving away from those first few chapters where Morgenthau gets this bleak view of humanity, but at the end of the day, we're all sovereign people. Power is how we regulate stuff between each other and the institutions to make sure we don't rely just on power, but at the end of the day, all these institutions are fundamentally based around power. So if a patient wants to change status quo, it'll be power that stops them. Of course, Morgenthau's going to recommend that we abdicate our sovereignty so we don't rely on power so much. Chapter 25, International Government. Each of the 3 world wars of the last century and a half was followed by an attempt to establish an international government. The total failure to keep international order and peace called forth an overall effort to make international order and peace secure. The Holy Alliance of the Napoleonic Wars, the League of Nations, the First World War, the United Nations, the Second World War. With regard to each of these attempts of international government, 3 questions must be asked. Were it the authority to govern vested, or who was it to be governed? And 2. By what principle of justice is a government to be guided, or what is the conception of the common good to be realized by the government? Or 3. To what extent has the government been able to maintain order and peace? So, quick history. For those that know the Holy Alliances, I mentioned the UN. The Holy Alliance is basically another collective security attempt or international morality institutionalized that occurred after the Napoleonic Wars. It fell apart pretty quickly. Morgenthau gives a history. I think it fell apart in like 5 years after the war ended. Morgenthau gives the full history of it. I'm not going to deal with history on this channel that much. Mostly deal with concepts here, but you can go read all the history. It's like 5 pages. The Concert of Europe had more success. Concert of Europe, they basically mentioned that the 19th century had a very strong moral leaning. They wanted to make all these international institutions that help prevent war. Concert of Europe is the idea that all the European powers, international humanitarian going on, they're able to get some meaningful stuff done, and 19th century is famously peaceable. And on the surface, what we analyzed so far, it shouldn't be peaceable because universal nationalism was on the rise, we lacked institutions, things were breaking down, but yet it was so peaceful, so Morgenthau explains why that was. On the one hand, it was not institutionalized. There's no institutions back in the Concert of Europe. The great powers met whenever the international situation seemed to demand concerted action. On the other hand, the Concert of Europe was no longer animated by a strong moral consensus, which could have neutralized conflicts and supplied standards for common judgments and actions. Yet, despite the lack of a strong moral consensus, of an international institutionalized government by conferences, let alone an organized one, the Concert of Europe was the most successful in preserving general peace during the 90 years of its existence. 3 factors must be mentioned. In that period of history, the moral consensus of the European community lived in a feeble echo, strengthened, however, by humanitarian moral climate of the times. The political constellation, as we have seen, favored expansion into political empty spaces with the accommodation of conflicting interests. Finally, and most importantly, however, the period of history saw the succession of brilliant diplomatists and statesmen who knew how to make peace, how to preserve peace, and how to keep war short and limited in scope. So Morgenthau is going to base his conclusion on the book on this period of history, saying, look, we should have had wars at this time, but it was solely mainly diplomacy that stopped these wars from occurring. Part 9, Peace Through Transformation, the World State. Our investigation of the problem of international peace has left with us 2 conclusions. No attempt to solve the problem of international peace by limiting the national aspirations for power has succeeded, and none could have succeeded under the conditions of the modern state system. National societies owe their peace in order to the existence of the state. What is needed in order to save the world for its self-destruction is not the limitation of exercise of national sovereignty through international obligations and institutions, but the transference of the sovereignties of individual states to a world authority which would be as sovereign within their respective territories. And Morgenthau has mentioned previously, I don't think I put it was for it, but the state, because it has a sovereign, is peaceable between people within it and limit their power within there. So if we had a world state, a state managing the states, make the world sovereign, then we can manage our relations between each other, as Billy argues. Peace among social groups within the state reposes upon a dual foundation: the disinclination of the members of the society to break the peace and their inability to break the peace if they should be so inclined. They must feel loyalties to the society as a whole which surpass their loyalties to any part of it. They must be able to expect from society at least an approximation to justice through at least partial satisfaction of their demands. The presence of these three conditions, overwhelming force, supersectional loyalties, and expectation of justice, makes peace possible within states. The state is indispensable for the maintenance of domestic peace, yet the state itself cannot maintain domestic peace. Yet the state by itself cannot maintain domestic peace. Such is the great admission of Hobbes' philosophy. A total of 278 wars fought between 1480 and 1941, 28% were civil wars. In the period from 1840 to 1941, the figure was 1 in 3. The state is not the artificial creation of a constitutional convention. The state is what the society is from, which has sprung, and prospers and decays. Society prospers and decays. Yet, the overwhelming majority of people would put the welfare of their own nation above everything else, the interests of the world state included. Nor are the people of the world willing and able to do what is necessary to keep the world government standing. If they're not prepared to perform the reevaluation of all values, that unprecedented moral and political revolution which would force the nation from its throne and put the political organization of humanity on it. They're willing and able to sacrifice and die so that national governments may be kept standing. The man who would want to oppose the interests and policies of his own nation for the sake of humanity and its state would, by that active opposition, weakening his own nation, strengthen the nation with which his own government might be engaged in deadly combat. Nothing shows more strikingly the absence of the social and moral preconditions for anything resembling a world state than the moral paradox that a man would want to act as a citizen of the world would by the conditions of the world be forced to act as a partisan of another nation and as a traitor of his own. So I guess one potential example would be like Edward Snowden, who, showed that the USA, which was trying to preserve its national security, allegedly was breaking crimes, and the U.S. saw him as a traitor for revealing the U.S. using these tactics to try to increase its national security, and was forced to flee to places like Russia. Whether he was working for Russia or not, unclear. But if we assume he was not working for Russia, we can say that, well, he was trying to help humanity per se, or at least the U.S., people of the U.S., and as a result, he's viewed as a partisan for another nation now. There's been many such people throughout history. The Russians, the people in the USSR era, or when the USSR was a thing still, there'd be many Russians who work for the CIA because they like Russia, and they don't like the USSR ruling Russia. So they would, when they get caught by Russia for being a spy for the U.S., even though the people are trying to help Russia, they'd be executed as traitors for the Soviet Union. If you want to try to, it's a dilemma. There is no shirking the conclusion that the international peace cannot be permanent without a world state. There can be no state without a society willing and able to support it. There can be no world state without a world community willing and able to support it. How then can a world state be created? Two solutions have been offered. World conquest, an example to Switzerland, the creation of the United States by the Constitutional Convention of 1787. So I'll briefly talk about world conquest. We didn't talk about it in the book, but world conquest. If you look at the Chinese system, so I'll probably give. There's a book I want to talk about called what's it called? War and State Formation in Early Modern Europe and Ancient China by Victoria Timbo-Crowe. I'll talk about that book eventually. We'll get there. But essentially, the Qin Empire, or the Qin state, was a little small desert state on the outside of the Chinese system. So, in the international system, Europe, China didn't have much contact back then. So they were kind of self-contained international systems. In a Chinese system, they had the barbarians that they saw on the outside, but you don't really talk about those. Look at the main core system. And the Qin was a little desert state, pretty weak on the out core of it. but through internal reforms was able to conquer the entirety of the state. Now, the Qin didn't form a world world society when it conquered everything. It just conquered it with totalitarian. And this is the Chinese history 20 times over. It happened again during the Han. It happened again after the Song fell when the Mongols took over everything. Just an outside invader conquering everything despite the lack of a national society. And the Chinese, in recent times, are trying to create the Han identity by putting a bunch of ethnic groups together. And we can get into the different theories of ethnicity. There's a modernist theory, a basically a functionalist theory. There's a theory that holds out they're much older than that. But essentially, the Chinese, at least in this case, intentionally created a Han identity to make a national society so that they could rule the world system. I guess it's an international society at that point, but so they could rule the world system. But in any case, so when the world conquest does happen, Morgenthau does mention. Oh no, he just says it right. I did have a quote for it. All historical political structures which have one thing common in being two world states have one thing common. One powerful state created them by conquering the other members of what was then known as the political world. Most of these world states have another thing in common. They hardly ever survived the lifetime of their founders. So in China, the Qin dynasty, they actually did survive the lifetime of the founder about like a few days. And then the people of China, so one of the Qin family conquered all of China. The people of China then executed every single member of the Qin family, women and children included. So now nobody in China has the last name Qin anymore. So how the Chinese system went about. The example the United States proves, so Switzerland, you can talk about Switzerland, I'm not going to talk about Switzerland, but the United States, Switzerland basically, you had a national identity form, put everything together. I think the United States is like the pinnacle of this. The example of the United States proves that only independence of any state which should be expected to endure upon a pre-existing moral and political community. The 13 colonies formed a moral and political community under the British Crown. They tested it, became fully aware of it in their common struggle against Britain, and then retained that community after they had won their independence. The community of the American people antedated the American state, but the world community must antedate a world state. So, start with the significance of the United States. Like, a state is something like Britain or France. The United States, it was called the United States because it took 13 individual states. In the Morgenthau, they didn't really have a sense of sovereignty back then. Debatable. But these 13 things that could have been states decided to unify itself together by giving their sovereignty to a governing federal authority, which is what Morgenthau thinks the world should look like. You think the world should be gigantic United States. We have the United Nations. And the name kind of suggests the same thing. It's just the United Nations failed, and it succeeded because we had this pre-existing community. So Morgenthau talked about the world community next. Chapter 27, the world community. This last conclusion that the world community must antedate the world state has given birth to two efforts to create a world community. The United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, known as UNESCO, and the other specialized agency of the United Nations. These all still exist. I'm sure you'll hear about UNESCO preserving things around the world, etc., etc. UNESCO was doing the same thing back then. The philosophy of UNESCO starts with the assumption that education, especially when it aims at international understanding, cultural interchange, and in general all activities which tend to increase contacts among members of different nations and make them understand each other in the area factors in that creation of the national community and the maintenance of peace. Implicit in this assumption is a supposition that nations are nationalistic and go to war with each other because they don't know each other well enough and because they operate on different levels of education and culture. Both assumptions are erroneous. There are peoples, highly educated and steeped in classical culture, such as the Germans, who are generally nationalistic and warlike. The Athenians under Pericles and the Italians of the Renaissance created cultures not equaled in the history of Western civilization, and both were at least as nationalistic and warlike in that period of their history as any other time before and after. These examples taken at random, we have many, many more examples after those few, at random show the quantity and quality of education and culture as such is obviously irrelevant to the issue of a world community. That issue hinges not upon knowledge and upon appreciation of cultural values, but upon a moral and political transformation of unprecedented dimensions. I mentioned that transformation previously. The existence of a multitude of interpersonal relations transcending national boundaries is no answer to our problem. More particularly, the existence of intellectual and aesthetic ties across national boundaries proves that nothing in favor of a world community. A world community with political potentialities is a community of moral standards and political action, not of intellect and sentiments. Cultural unity, much closer than anything UNESCO can plan and achieve, has coexisted with war in all periods of history, yet these cultures did not create a community coextensive with themselves. Among those from whom the beginning were most firmly opposed to the foreign objective of the Nazi regime, even at risk of war, were some with the most profound understanding of German culture. It was exactly that understanding which made the implacable enemies of the Nazi regime. Similarly, those who understand Russia and the Russians have as a rule been equally unaffected by the pro and anti-Russian hysteria. And it makes also an analogy to China, the China experts who went to China having a great opinion of China, left with a terrible opinion of China. So increased cultural knowledge made them more prone to not have peace. These specialized agencies of the United Nations, serving peoples all over the world regardless of national boundaries, could create, by the very fact of their existence and performance, a community of such of interests, valuations, and actions. Ultimately, as such international agencies, so you don't include that UNESCO's not going to work. I'm saying that if we had nations that provide functions internationally commonly to all people, from a community through these functions by attachment to them. Ultimately, if such international agencies would be numerous enough and would serve the important wants of most people on the earth, the loyalties of the institutions and to the international community of which they are agencies would supersede the loyalties to separate national societies and institutions. However, in peace, what the nation has to offer the individual seems to outweigh by far the benefits derived from functional agencies of the International Charter. The nations offer individual protection, vicarious gratification of power drives, and immediate satisfaction of material needs. Thus, the contributions which international functional agencies make to the well-being of members of all nations fade into the background. We find that the creation of international community presupposes at least the mitigation and minimization of international conflicts, so the interests which unite the members in different nations may outweigh the interests which separate them. How can international conflicts be mitigated and minimized? This is the final question which calls for examination. Now we've reached the final part of Morgenthau, peace through accommodation. Is going to get into diplomacy. So, chapter 28. Diplomacy. The means at the disposal of diplomacy are three: persuasion, compromise, threat of force. Rarely, if ever, in the conduct of a foreign policy of great power is there justification for only using one method to the exclusion of the others. The decline of diplomacy set in with the end of the First World War. In the 1920s, a few outstanding diplomatists were still able to make important contributions to the foreign policies of their countries. In the decade preceding the Second World War, the part which diplomatists took in shaping foreign policies became even smaller, and this decline of diplomacy as a technique of conducting foreign affairs became more and more patent. Since the end of the Second War, diplomacy has lost its vitality, and its function have withered away to such an extent that without precedent history of the modern state system. 5 factors account for this decline. Diplomacy owes its rise in part to the absence of speedy communications. Diplomacy owes its decline in part to the development of speedy and regular communications. So, before you had landlines or telegraphs, if you want to communicate with another nation, you'd have someone already positioned there to talk with them, to represent you and make decisions for you as a sovereign. But now sovereigns, if you ever multiplied a warfare in this channel, probably like a few months from now, you'll see that once these communication lines started with the military too, militaries became more centralized to their detriment, because the decentralized military is more effective, because the sovereign or dictator, whoever, they really want to control all affairs. They're very totalitarian in that matter by disposition. So if they can control all their foreign affairs, they're going to do so. To the technological ability to part with the services of diplomacy must be added the conviction that those services ought to be parted with, because they not only contribute nothing to the cause of peace, but actually endanger it. The conviction grew in the same soil which nourished the conception of power politics as an accident if history be eliminated. Remember, last video I did on Morgenthau's mainstream American foreign policy. This line of reasoning makes sense, and we go into that much here. It was in defense of this new moralizing philosophy that after the First World War, the statesmen of the world began to depart from the established pattern of diplomacy. They created in the League of Nations and in the United Nations a new type of diplomatic intercourse, diplomacy by parliamentary procedure. Because at the time, they really hated secret treaties. They really blamed like World War One and to the extent World War II on secret negotiations that are ongoing. Morgenthau argues that secret negotiations are necessary to actually do diplomacy. We'll get to that probably in a few paragraphs from now. But that the parliamentary procedure eliminates all secrecy. They want to formalize everything. But human relations can't be formalized. Trying to formalize them, things break down. And then, so now he's going to argue that the U.S. We're going to explain why the U.S. doesn't have strong diplomacy right now. And then why the USSR doesn't have strong diplomacy, and why the U.S. and the USSR lack strong diplomacy. This country has been really, really bad, and he was right because we had the Cuban Missile Crisis that I'll get to once I read these paragraphs. He doesn't get into himself; it happened at the time, but I'll explain it to you. In the formative years, the U.S. benefits from the services of unusually brilliant diplomacy. From the Jacksonian era on, the eminent qualities of American diplomacy disappeared as the need for them seemed to disappear. When the need for an active American foreign policy became manifest in the late 1930s, there's nothing to build upon but a mediocre foreign service. President Roosevelt alone, guided by an intuitive grasp of international realities, kept American foreign policy in tune with American interest. When Roosevelt left the scene, there was no man or group of men who were capable of creating and operating the intricate and subtle machinery. So, basically says, okay, right now, Truman administration, we have no diplomatic service that can do what we need to do. It's a quick history. Under the Truman administration, they created the CIA, they created the Security Council, and they started making the Foreign Service be a thing again. So all at once, the U.S. is like, okay, we have to not be isolationists, which they had in the 1930s and 20s, which Morgenthau talks about in the article I mentioned a few seconds ago. So now they actually go make everything to be a superpower. And the Soviet Union also lacks all this stuff. For quote, different reasons. The Soviet Union has failed to develop adequate instruments for diplomatic intercourse. The Bolshevist Revolution of 1917 destroyed the Russian diplomatic service. The hostility between the Soviet Union and most other nations resulting in the isolation of the Soviet Union prevented the conduct of normal diplomatic relations. The Russia had a great diplomatic service before 1917. Bolshevists saw it as a relation to power or politics. They got rid of it all. Let's go to the USSR thought, that within like 20, 30, 40, 50 years, Bolsheviks would win everywhere, the capitalizations would naturally fall. So we don't need diplomacy with them. They're going to fall on their own. The Russian diplomat is the emissary of a totalitarian country. We'll talk about the then current Soviet diplomats. Is the emissary of a totalitarian country which punishes failure or even too much discretion interpreting official orders. In consequence, post-revolutionary Russian diplomats conceived of their task as the transmission of proposals of their government which other governments might accept or reject as they see fit. Diplomatic intercourse resembles nothing so much as a series of military orders related from high command who in turn communicate the terms of surrender to the enemy. So, talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis. So, I'm not going to really get a history of it, much more consequences of it. There were brinksmanship led to the possibility of nuclear war between the USSR and the U.S. over ongoings in Cuba. However, the U.S. lacked any strong diplomatic ties to the USSR to communicate with them. The result of the missile crisis, the conclusion of it, ended with the U.S. getting a direct telephone line to the Kremlin. And this merely illustrates, the U.S. and the USSR was so diplomatically inept, they didn't even have a phone line to each other's offices. And nowadays, we have phone lines to China, but the officials that pick up are so afraid of saying anything they don't want to get, killed by the party for saying the wrong thing, that they don't function. We can't talk to the Chinese because the diplomats don't have any leeway to make decisions for their own foreign policy. And oftentimes the Chinese officials, I remember the military back in 2011 blew up a satellite in space and caused a massive amount of debris, which is a really big problem when it comes to space. We're making debris everywhere. And then when the foreign diplomats were asked, why did you guys do this? They had no idea it even happened because all the branches don't talk to each other. The diplomats are terrified saying anything for the military branch. They don't know what the military branch is doing. If there's anything wrong, they're going to get kicked out. And it's really bad to take a knock in Chinese society, because like Chinese society is like the Indian caste system, except the Chinese official can pick what caste you are at any given time. So they don't want to mess up. It's called the Hukou system, by the way. The future of diplomacy. This is Morgenthau's big conclusion here, after all these pages. The new parliamentary diplomacy is no substitute for classical procedures. On the contrary, it tends to aggravate rather than mitigate international conflicts and leaves the prospect for peace dim rather than brightened. The three essential qualities of the new diplomacy are responsible for these unfortunate results: its publicity, its majority votes, and its fragmentation of international issues. It only takes common sense derived from daily experience to realize that it is impossible to negotiate in public on anything in which parties other than the negotiators are interested. The saving grace of negotiations is a result which satisfies the demand on either side, at least up to a point, and which tends to strengthen amity between the parties by demonstrating in an active agreement the existence of identical or complementary interests in being them together. On the other hand, the process leading up to the results reveals the parties and their roles which they would rather not be remembered by their fellows. To publicize such negotiations is tantamount to destroying, or at least impairing, the bargaining position of the parties in any further negotiations in which they might be engaged with other parties. As far as negotiations goes, like having secret information gives you leverage. If you have to reveal secret information in public, you lose that leverage for all future negotiations. You also think, when you negotiate, like in these very rough environments, you say things that you don't want other people saying. You acting in that manner, it's very heated. It's all lots of showmanship. You don't want that showmanship being public remembered. In the Security Council of the United Nations, this method has developed into the tradition of 9 members voting down 2, the Soviet Union and one of its friends. Now, this method of conducting the business diplomacy has solved no single issues is as obvious from the results. And yeah, the Security Council passes nothing. And it's never passed. So during the Korean War, it actually did pass a resolution to go help South Korea to help North Korea. But that only ever happened because Russia was protesting the Security Council's mechanism and didn't show to the meeting. So they passed the resolution against Russia to go help fight the North Koreans, and Russia never missed a day in the Security Council ever again. That was a very bad mistake on their part. On the international scene, no such system of integrating factors exists. Consequently, it is here particularly inadequate to take up one case or issue after the other and try to dispose of them by a succession of majority votes. A case or issue such as the Greek or Palestinian, both issues we have still today is always a particular phase and manifestation of a much larger situation. Such a case or issue is rooted in the historic past and extends its ramifications beyond a particular locale and into the future. To deal with these cases or issues as they arise and to try to dispose of them accordingly to international law or political expediency is a deal with the surface phenomenon and leave the underlying problems undiscovered and unsolved. The promise of diplomacy, its 8 rules. So now he's going to list out his 8 rules of diplomacy. He talked about them for quite some time. I'm just going to list them off and maybe say a little bit about them. 1. Diplomacy must be invested in the crusading spirit. Listen to my video in the article. He talks all about that. 2. The objectives of foreign policy must be defined in terms of the national interest and must be supported with adequate power. So the part 1 is national interest. He argues in the article again that it is moral to follow the national interest. It's immoral not to. But that adequate power backing, is the start of the first part of the book. If you don't have power, you can't get anything done. So if you need to have power to support your national interest. You can't get away from power politics, basically saying there. 3. Diplomacy must look at the political scene from the point of view of all other nations. 4. Nations must be willing to compromise on all issues not vital to them. The USSR and US were both breaking this at the time to an extreme. 5. Give up the shadow of worthless rights for the substance of real advantage. What he means here is that international law, you have rights to things. But by following international law only, you're missing on a lot of things you could be doing on the world stage. So you should be willing to break the formalities of international law to actually go about real negotiations. You shouldn't constrain yourself to parliamentary procedures. You should actually go out there and get stuff done. 6. Never put yourself in a position from which you cannot retreat without losing face, and from which you cannot advance without grave risks. 7. Never allow a weak ally to make decisions for you. And 8. The armed forces are the instrument of foreign policy, not its master. The reader who has followed us up to this point may well ask, but has not diplomacy failed in preventing war in the past? To that legitimate question, two answers can be given. It has failed sometimes because nobody wanted it to succeed. When war was normal activity of kings, the task of diplomacy was not to prevent it, but to bring war about at the most propitious moment, like World War I, World War II. The Germans did not want diplomacy to succeed; they wanted war. On the other hand, when nations have used diplomacy for the purpose of preventing war, they've often succeeded. Diplomacy is the best means of preserving peace which a society of sovereign nations has to offer. But under the conditions of modern world politics, but especially under the conditions of modern world politics and modern war, it is not good enough. But under the conditions of modern world politics and modern war, it is not good enough. It is only when nations have surrendered their means of destruction which modern technologies have put in their hands to a higher authority, when they have given up their sovereignty, that international peace can be made as secure as domestic peace. Diplomacy can make peace more secure than it is today, and the world state can make more secure than it would be if nations were abide by the rules of diplomacy. Yet, as there can be no permanent peace without a world state, there can be no world state without the peace-preserving community-building process of diplomacy. I'm now going to read the final half page of Morgenthau's Politics Among Nations for this very long journey. And I need more coffee. I should have drank that before the episode. If authorities were needed in support of the conception of international peace presented in these pages, it can be found in the counsel of a man who has committed fewer errors in international affairs than any of his contemporaries, Winston Churchill. Viewing with concern the contemporary scene in his speech of the House of Commons on January 23, 1948, and asking himself, will there be war, Mr. Churchill called for peace through accommodation when he said, I will not only venture now to say that there seems to be a very real danger in going on drifting too long. I believe that the best chance of preventing war is to bring matters to a head and come to a settlement with the Soviet government before it is too late. This would imply that the Western democracies, who should of course seek unity among themselves at the earliest moment, would take the initiative in asking the Soviet for a settlement. It is idle to reason or argue with the communists. It is, however, possible to deal with them on a fair, realistic basis, and in my experience, they will keep their bargains as long as it is in their interest to do so, which might, in this grave matter, be a long time once things are settled. There are very grave dangers, that is all I'm going to say today, and letting everything run on and pile up until something happens, and it passes, all of a sudden, out of your control. With all considerations of the facts, I believe it is right to say that the best chance of avoiding war is, in accord with the other Western democracies, to bring matters to a head with the Soviet government and by formal diplomatic processes, and with all their privacy and gravity, to arrive at a lasting settlement. There is certainly enough for the interest of all if such a settlement could be reached. Even this method, I must say, however, would not guarantee that war would not come, but I believe would give the best chance of a coming out of it alive. That is Morgenthau's Politics Among Nations. I will be moving on to Kenan next. Thank you for listening.